What do you make of this entire Bulls season, especially last night with Zach LaVine's comment saying that the Hawks wanted it more in a pretty pivotal game down the stretch?
Yeah, that's quite an indictment in Game 79 when you say the other team just wanted it more, especially considering the fact that the Hawks' best player, Trae Young, sat out because of illness. And you figured the Bulls were at home coming off a good win over Memphis on Sunday and with a chance to move up in the standings. Had they beaten the Hawks, they would have moved into a tie with Atlanta, would have had the tiebreaker if they finished with the same record. They had a lot to play for, and yet they came out flat. They were down 13-2. They spent the rest of the night trying to catch up, and they never really could. A very similar storyline to what we've seen in a lot of the losses this year. The Bulls could not make any three-point shots, and their opponents could, and that was a big difference in the game.
What's wrong with this team, Mark?
Well, I tell you what, it's been different stories from night to night. Some nights they don't protect the ball. Some nights they struggle to rebound. But I think the biggest stat that really has stood out all season long is the one I mentioned earlier. They are last in the NBA in three-point attempts and near the bottom in three-point makes. And like it or not, the NBA has become a three-point shooting league. And AK and his staff knew that going into the offseason, that one of the areas they needed to address was to improve their three-point shooting ability. They chose not to do that, and that's really hurt them this season. DeMar DeRozan has had a good season, certainly not up to a second-team All-NBA like he had a year ago. Zach LaVine has come on really strong in the latter two-thirds of the season, but yet they don't have that supporting cast that can give them the three-point shooting that would really open up driving lanes for LaVine and DeRozan. And a lot of nights they just struggle to score.
Why do you think they refuse to address that sort of situation, both in the offseason and then at the trade deadline just a few weeks ago?
Well, this is something Bulls fans really don't like to hear, but the reality of it is that Jerry Reinsdorf has always been consistent in saying that he will not go into the luxury tax unless he feels like he has a team that can compete for a championship. I think in the estimation of the two Reinsdorfs, Jerry and Michael, who runs the Bulls franchise now, and the front office, they felt like they were not a team that was capable of going deep into the Eastern Conference playoffs. And by virtue of that, they didn't go out at the trade deadline and try to extend themselves and maybe bring in a couple of shooters that could have helped them over the final third of the season. They're going to have to take a hard look at the roster during the summer and decide what their priorities are going to be. But again, they're going to be squeezed up against that luxury tax line, and they're going to have to decide whether or not they're going to go beyond that to try to make a team that can not only qualify for the playoffs, but maybe compete against some of the heavyweights in the Eastern Conference.
I'll tell you what sticks out to me right there is that they're near the luxury tax threshold, and they're barely getting into the play-in game, let alone the actual first six seeds. That's a problem, right, Mark?
Yeah, and I think the roster was constructed with the idea that there would be some internal improvement from guys like Patrick Williams and Kobe White, and that would maybe help fill in some of the gaps that they have in terms of their offense. It really hasn't worked out the way that they had hoped. Kobe White has shown some signs lately that he can be a very useful rotation player in the league. Patrick Williams has been up and down, kind of like the Bulls. Some nights he looks really good. Other nights you barely notice that he's out there. They do have to take a hard look at the roster. Nikola Vucevic will be a free agent this summer. Kobe White and Ayo Dosunmu will also be free agents, although both are restricted. And they're going to have to make a decision on who they want to keep and what ways they can use to try to improve the roster. There's going to be changes to the roster. I think that more than likely they're going to decide to break up the DeRozan-LaVine 1-2 punch, and one of those two will probably be traded elsewhere to try to bring in more size and more three-point shooting to this team.
Does that mean there could be a rebuild or a retool on the fly for next year?
Well, I think since they gave Zach LaVine a max contract last summer, the 5-year deal, I think Zach is going to be around unless they get an incredible offer for him and they decide that he's the one to go and they decide to keep DeMar DeRozan instead. But I think it's much more likely that DeRozan is traded for either draft picks and or players to try to really give them, like you mentioned, a rebuild on the fly. I don't think anyone in the Bulls organization has the stomach for tearing it down and trying to build it back up again, because right now they don't have a lot of draft capital, and that's usually the route that you want to go if you're going to tear it down all the way. I think they feel like there's enough talented pieces on this roster that maybe with some tweaks to the team, they can be in a better position next year. But the reality of it is, you've got Milwaukee, Boston, and Philadelphia that are heavyweights in the East. They're not going anywhere. Cleveland is only going to get better in the short term. You've got 4 teams in the East that are going to really be tough to hurdle in the near term. And I think that the organization really has to do some soul searching in their offseason meetings and decide what's the best course to try to not only get into contention status for the short term, but also to maybe look at the next 5 years and see what moves do we need to make sure that we don't sink to the bottom again. Because trying to go to the hope for lottery luck and free agency has proven not to be a very successful formula in the NBA.
How did the Bulls even get into this situation? AKK Manny got rid of pretty much everybody from the Garpax era, and now we sit here today and the Bulls are pretty much in the same spot they were about 4 years ago. What happened?
Well, I think AK was really being praised for all the bold moves he made back in the summer of 21. You remember at the time when they acquired DeMar DeRozan, everyone was amazed that they could get a multiple-time All-Star to come to Chicago when they hadn't won in several years. That move was really being hailed league-wide, as was the sign and trade for Lonzo Ball, which happened right at the start of free agency, which of course cost him a second-round draft pick when the league decided they contacted him too early. But both those moves were universally loved at the time. The Vucevic trade was loved at the time because, Wendell Carter had been a disappointment since the Bulls drafted him 7th overall back in 2018. So, it looked like they had the makings of a team that was going to be a contender in the East. We all remember what happened at the beginning of last season. They were tied for the top record in the East going into the All-Star break, and then the injuries to Ball and Caruso set them back, and they dropped all the way back to the 6th position and were quickly drummed out of the playoffs by Milwaukee. No one could have foreseen the Lonzo Ball situation being as dire as it has turned out to be. He did have some knee issues, both with the Lakers and with the Pelicans, that maybe should have been some sort of a red flag. But remember, the Bulls acquired him. He was a 24-year-old player who was the number 2 overall pick, who seemed to fit perfectly with the other pieces that they already had on the roster. And he played exceptionally well in that half a season he was in a Bulls uniform. But now, he just underwent a 3rd surgery on that knee, and no one knows if he'll ever play again, much less play at a high level.
How do you evaluate Karnisovas's and Ebersley's moves so far as president and GM?
Well, as I said, I was very positive about the moves they made back in the summer of 21. What they did was they brought in a veteran group that you felt like they could contend immediately in the Eastern Conference, maybe not get all the way to the finals, but a team that could be definitely a playoff squad and maybe even win a round or two. But, because of bad luck and not really solidifying some parts of the roster, they've taken a big step back this year. Now the challenge for AK and his staff is to try to come up with some moves they can make within the constraints of the way the organization is structured to try to make this a better team that's not just fighting for a play-in, but maybe fighting for home court advantage in the first round.
I know this might be too soon, Mark, but is there any talk or have you heard anything about Karnisovas being shown the door, being on thin ice after all these things have come to pass?
No, I don't think so. I think the Bulls were very impressed with him throughout the interview process. Karnisovas is a guy who was very well respected around the league. He got very positive reviews from other people in the front office business. And when he came in, he quickly showed that he wasn't afraid to make bold moves. He turned over the roster completely, as you mentioned. Kobe White and Zach LaVine are the only remaining guys from the roster that he inherited. And I feel like he's shown that he's not afraid to make a bold trade. I think after the trade deadline this past season, when he held his news conference, you could see that in his body language. I mean, he kept banging the desk in front of him to emphasize how frustrated he was that he wasn't able to get something done. And I think that had to do with the fact that whatever moves that might have been available to him, he couldn't do because of luxury tax constraints. So I think this summer he'll get a much longer leash in terms of being able to move pieces around and maybe make some bigger moves rather than just trying to make a couple of fringe moves. That's really not going to make a big difference to whether this roster can just barely squeak into the playoffs.
Is there anybody specific you think the Bulls should focus on coming up in free agency?
It's too early to tell right now, John. A lot of that depends on how these playoffs shake out. You're always going to have a situation where some team gets beat early and frustration comes out, and all of a sudden a player you thought wasn't available suddenly is. We've heard some comments out of Boston where Jaylen Brown has indicated that, maybe he's not been shown as much love as he would like from the Celtics organization. let's say, for example, Boston loses in the first or second round. That may become a firestorm instead of just a little spark. And all of a sudden, Jaylen Brown might become available. Luka Doncic may, if Dallas misses the playoffs, he may try to force his way out of Dallas. You just can't foresee what guys might suddenly become available. And the job of any NBA executive is to make sure that you have the assets in place to make a bold move when it presents itself. A couple other guys who may seek trades. Damian Lillard, Portland again was saying they were going to build around him, try to get back into the playoffs. They started out okay this year, but then sunk miserably in the second half, where I think they have the 5th worst record in the league right now. And then Bradley Beal out with the Wizards. They're another underachieving team. So that's 4 All-Stars right there who could become available in trade. Now, I'm not saying the Bulls have the combination of assets, especially with their lack of draft picks, to make that type of trade. But I think that AK has shown that he's willing to really talk about any kind of superstar that might be out there. And, today on April 5th, I don't think we can really foresee who might be available come July 1.
Mark, how different is this game compared to when you covered the Jordan era, for example, or even covering this game early in the 2000s? You mentioned all these players who are suddenly could be available, going to be out there. How different is this for you versus 20 years ago?
It's funny you asked that question because, on Monday there was no NBA because they take the night off to let the college national championship have the spotlight. And so NBA TV has to run filler programming, just to get through their broadcast day. And they ran a replay of a 1988 game between the Bulls and the Pistons. And I'll tell you what, John, they could have had guys arrested for assault and battery in that game. Guys were getting knocked to the ground, hit in the head, taken out on drives to the basket. And they just got up, went to the free throw line, shot their free throws, and it was no big deal. Now everything is reviewed to see if it's a flagrant one. Most of them turn out to be flagrant ones. And I'm not saying I'm in favor of guys going out headhunting and trying to injure players, but I think we've taken a lot of the physicality out of the modern game. We don't see many back-to-the-basket scorers anymore. I mean, even your prolific big men like Joel Embiid, he gets a lot of his points shooting 17-foot jump shots. And he can make 3-pointers as well. He had 52 the other night in their win over Boston. So you're not seeing the back-to-the-basket center. You're not seeing as much physical play. The 3-point shot rule, scoring is way up. It is a completely different game. It's entertaining. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I love watching when Steph Curry gets hot and is making 3-pointers from 35 feet. It's fun to watch. But at times, teams get into the trap of thinking that just because the other team is making threes, we have to do that too. And, the Bulls, I believe, were like 7 for 32 yesterday from the 3-point line. Hey, if they're not going in, try something different. I know my friend Stacey King was talking about on the broadcast yesterday when Vooch got a couple of low post buckets. He said, just do that more often. He says, I'm tired of saying this on every broadcast. They should go inside of the big man and get some easy baskets instead of shooting and missing so many 3-point shots.
How do you like watching today's game? Is it more entertaining, or when you compare maybe the 90s, the Bulls, the Jordan years, which era would you prefer?
I think all eras have their appeal.
Sure.
When I first started watching basketball when I was a kid, that was the Will Chamberlain, Bill Russell era. And, you only had 12 teams in the league, and it was the same. You'd see the same games on TV all the time. Generally, you'd have Boston against Philadelphia with Russell against Wilt playing, 12 times a year. So that wasn't great because the Celtics were winning all those championships, and there really wasn't a lot of competition. There were only a couple of teams that even could come close to competing with him. Then you went into the 70s, and there was a lot of good teams or a lot of different teams that had a chance to win championships. And then you got into the 80s, and it was the Bird and Magic era, and it was the Celtics-Lakers in the finals every year. So, every year it seems like there's been a few teams that have stood out above the rest. It's a game that's really kind of lended itself to teams making kind of dynastic runs, which we've seen with Golden State over the last half decade. And I don't know whether that's necessarily good or bad. I would like to see, some teams maybe try to go away from always having to go with small ball lineups and shooting threes. I mean, Billy Donovan right now, most nights has 4 guards on the floor with a center, for most of the game. And, when you've got Alex Caruso at 6'3" or 6'4" trying to guard LeBron or Giannis, it's not much fun to watch because you're just giving up way too much size.
What do you expect the Bulls to do this year, assuming they now make the play-in tournament and face whoever they will in this first round?
Yeah, well, they've already clinched that play-in, and they're pretty much locked into that 10 slot. So they'll either go to Toronto or Atlanta for that first game, and my guess is that it'll probably be Toronto because they have a tough schedule. Their last 3 games, they play 2 in Boston, and then they play Milwaukee the last game of the year. Although Milwaukee may sit their guys the last game if they have everything clinched. But if they go to Toronto, I don't give them much of a chance because Toronto is a bad matchup for the Bulls. We've seen that during the season when the Raptors won 2 out of 3. They have a team that has a lot of size. They have a lot of switchable guys that are 6'7" to 6'9", and the Bulls don't match up very well. So, it's a one-game situation. It's like the NCAA tournament, one and done. So I'm certainly not discounting their chances to have a good shooting night and to go into Toronto and win. But just looking at the matchup on paper and what we've seen throughout the course of the regular season, the odds would tell you that most likely they'll lose in Toronto, and then it's on to the offseason.
Should we celebrate a Bulls play-in tournament victory? Is this something we should be propping up if they win it and move on to the next round?
No, celebrate. No, definitely not. I mean, after what they did last year, winning 46 games, being the 6th seed in the East, even after a late season slump, the expectations were so much higher. Arturas said as much when he said, we expect to do better than we did last season, which would indicate at least winning 1 playoff round. And unfortunately, because of a combination of injuries and some guys not playing as well as expected, they've struggled with inconsistency throughout the year. And if he's going to try to run it back, I don't think that's going to be looked upon very favorably by the fan base because Lonzo Ball is going to miss most, if not all, of next season. They're going to have to find a point guard. I know there's been some sentiment in some areas of the media and the fan base that maybe Kobe White can be the starting point guard next year, and maybe that is the route they go. He has improved his ball handling. I think his decision-making is a lot sounder than it was when he came into the league as a 19-year-old. But whether or not he can be an impact point guard on a team that you hope to go deep into the playoffs, that remains to be seen.
What about Patrick Williams, too? I mean, this was supposed to be a prove-it year for him. I don't think he's proven too much yet.
Yeah, I've been disappointed by and large with what we've seen from Patrick in year 3. Last year he was hurt. He missed most of the season, and I certainly understand that, that kind of set back his development. But it's just, this whole competitive mindset. A lot of times he drifts in games, and for a guy who was the 4th overall pick in the draft, a guy who everyone would say has the ideal size to be an impact 3-and-D type of wing, too often he just doesn't make an impact in games. Now, granted, he's playing with 3 guys who are former All-Stars in DeRozan, Levine, and Vucevic, and he's a young guy who probably feels like he has to defer to them. But yet there are times in games where he'll catch the ball on the perimeter and he won't even look at the basket. He'll just swing it around to the next passing lane available. And I think for a guy that was drafted that highly, I think that he should have more of an impact on the game. Now, he's only 22. Maybe in years to come, we will see that. But when you get to the point, you get to your 4th or 5th year in the NBA, then you're talking about significant dollars that you have to reinvest to sign a guy. And to this point, he hasn't shown enough to consider signing him to some kind of a long-term contract at really high dollars.
Make a great point about Williams, and this brought up an idea for me of Lauri Markkanen. Can you explain to me what's happened to him this past year? I mean, it seems like the Bulls now kind of struck out on him when a few years ago it was quite the opposite.
Well, unfortunately, when Lowry came in here, he showed some flashes of being a really good player, but he was hurt. He was hurt so many times during his Bulls career. And then the last season with Billy Donovan, they kind of went away from him. They had just drafted Patrick Williams, and they tried to have Lowry play small forward at 7 feet. And that really wasn't working out too well. I mean, he was asked a lot of times to just stand in the corner and wait for the ball to swing to him. And then he lost his starting job when they made the Vucevic trade. And I think, he kind of felt like the front office and the coaching staff didn't really value him. So when it came time for him to go into restricted free agency, he told the front office, if I don't have a meaningful role here, why don't you go ahead and trade me? They made that 3-way deal with Cleveland and Portland to move him along. Markkanen had a good year in Cleveland, and then he was moved along to Utah in that huge trade for Donovan Mitchell, which really worked out for both sides because, Donovan Mitchell's been fantastic for the Cavs, and Markkanen is an all-star in Utah, and they get all those draft picks from Cleveland in exchange. But I think with Lowry, again, it was a guy drafted into the league at 19 years old. He got married at a young age. He had a child, he and his wife, and he had a lot of life things going on. He was hurt a lot. And I just think by the time he got to his fourth year in Chicago and his role was de-emphasized, he didn't know which way to turn. So, getting a new fresh start first in Cleveland and then in Utah, where they really featured him in the offense, brought out the best in him. I saw a stat the other day where he's the first player ever to make 200 three-point shots and 100 dunks in the same season. And he came into the United Center in one of the games I got a chance to fill in for Adam Amin on the play-by-play, and he had like 6 or 7 dunks, and he was dunking on everybody in the game. He's just, he's come out with a competitive mindset to be very aggressive, both in shooting the long ball and in going to the basket. And I think most of the credit on that should go to Lauri Markkanen. And while the Bulls should get some blame for not fully developing him, there were a lot of factors also that kind of held Lowry back.